Let's talk treasure. Gold. The shiny stuff. For thousands of years, it's been the ultimate bling, the symbol of "I've made it," the thing dragons hoard and pirates bury. Badly, by the looks of most treasure maps. Kings built empires on it, alchemists went slightly bonkers trying to make it, and even today, if you want to show someone you really love them, you probably don't hand them a salt shaker. But here's a spicy little historical nugget for you. What if I told you that for centuries, right through the often grim, definitely not always glamorous medieval times, something far more ordinary, something you probably have a slightly concerning amount of in your pantry right now, was often more valuable, more desperately sought after, and more crucial to, not dying, than all that glittering gold? Yep, we're talking about salt. So grab your snacks, preferably salted, because today we're digging into the fascinating and frankly, pretty wild story of why common or garden salt, the white gold of its day, held such incredible power in the medieval world. We'll see how it frequently kicked gold's shiny butt in terms of sheer, practical, life-sustaining value, shaping how people lived, ate, fought, and even prayed. Before we get too salty, let's paint a quick picture of the medieval world. It wasn't all knights in shining armor and happily ever afters. For starters, imagine your life without a refrigerator. Terrifying, right? No convenient chill box for your leftovers, no freezer aisle at ye old supermarket. Food spoilage wasn't just an "oops, forgot about that yogurt" inconvenience. It was a constant, relentless enemy. Think of it as a tiny, invisible army of bacteria and mold, always ready to invade your dinner. You had amazing abundance during harvest time. Fruits, veggies, the whole shebang. But then came winter, or a bad harvest, or just, Tuesday. If you lived far from fresh supplies, storing food for the lean times was not a hobby. It was a survival skill. So what were people actually eating? Well, if you were lucky, you had some protein, meat, fish, but that stuff goes off faster than a celebrity apology. Your mainstays were grains, like bread and porridge. Nutritious, sure, but imagine eating porridge 3 times a day, every day, without your favorite maple syrup or, heaven forbid, salt. The threat of famine wasn't some distant historical concept. It was a very real possibility lurking around the corner. Malnutrition was common, and a bad year could mean widespread starvation. It was, to put it mildly, a bit grim if your food preservation game wasn't strong. Finding a way to make food last, to stretch that hard-won harvest through the hungry months, wasn't just a neat trick. It was the absolute bedrock of survival. It determined whether your village made it through winter, whether your lord could feed his soldiers, whether your kids got enough to eat. And the most effective, most widespread, and most transformative solution they had? You guessed it. Our humble, unassuming hero, salt. This wasn't just a seasoning. It was a shield against decay, a passport to a longer shelf life, and, as we're about to see, a whole lot more. How does this humble white stuff actually perform its food-saving wizardry? It's not actual magic, though medieval folks might have been forgiven for thinking so. It's science. Cool, slightly gross, food science. The main villain in the food spoilage saga is moisture. Bacteria, molds, all those microscopic party crashers love a damp environment. What salt does, primarily through a process called osmosis, is act like a super thirsty bouncer at the door of this microbial disco. Salt basically sucks the water out of the food, making it a much less hospitable desert for those tiny beasties. It also draws water out of the bacteria themselves, effectively mummifying them. Harsh? Maybe. Effective? Absolutely. No water, no microbial hootenanny, no spoiled food. Simple, yet genius. Plus, high salt concentrations are just generally toxic to most microorganisms. It's like trying to throw a rave in a swimming pool full of salt. The vibe is just off. Now, where this salty superpower really came into its own was with meat. In a world without freezers, getting your hands on protein was one thing, but making it last was the real challenge. You had a couple of main methods: dry salting or corning, which is where we get corned beef, from the corns or grains of salt, involved literally rubbing handfuls of salt all over the meat. Then there was brining, which is basically giving your meat a nice long soak in a super salty bath. Think of it as a spa day, but one that ends with you being edible for months. The results? Bacon, ham, salted beef, sausages that wouldn't turn into a science experiment overnight. This was revolutionary. Armies on the march could carry provisions that wouldn't spoil in a week, Think of Roman legions or medieval knights. Their long campaigns were often fueled by salted meat. Navies setting sail on long voyages, those ships were practically floating charcuterie boards, packed to the gills with barrels of salted pork and beef. This wasn't just about a tasty snack. It was about projecting power and exploring the unknown. And for the average peasant family, being able to salt down a pig slaughtered in autumn meant having vital protein to see them through the harsh, lean winter months. Salt wasn't just a preservative. It was a lifeline. It wasn't just land animals getting the salty treatment. Fish, a crucial source of protein especially for coastal and riverine communities, were also prime candidates for preservation. Cod, herring, mackerel, these became staples not just locally, but for trade across vast distances, all thanks to salt. The Vikings, for example, were masters of drying and salting cod, creating stockfish that was light to transport and lasted for ages. Later, the Hanseatic League, a powerful medieval trading confederation in northern Europe, built a massive part of its fortune on the Baltic herring trade. They had the fishing grounds, sure, but their real trump card was access to the salt needed to preserve those millions of fish, which were then shipped all over Europe. Imagine the logistics. Entire fleets dedicated to catching, salting, and shipping. Salt turned perishable fish into a non-perishable, high-value commodity. It was the medieval equivalent of finding oil but smellier. But wait, there's more. Salt's preservative prowess wasn't limited to the fleshy stuff. Vegetables got in on the action too. Think sauerkraut. Fermented cabbage, a process heavily reliant on salt to control the good bacteria and kill off the bad. This wasn't just a tangy side dish. It was a way to keep vitamin C on the menu during long winters when fresh greens were a distant dream. And let's not forget pickling. Cucumbers, onions, beets. Pretty much anything that wasn't nailed down could be dunked in a salty, vinegary brine and kept for months. Even dairy owes a huge debt to salt. Cheesemaking, a vital way to preserve milk's nutrients, relies heavily on salt. It controls moisture, inhibits spoilage organisms, helps form the rind, and, of course, adds flavor. Without salt, your fancy medieval cheese board would be a very sad, very short-lived affair. So what does all this salting and brining and pickling add up to? A profound societal impact. With reliable food preservation, communities were less vulnerable to seasonal famines. This stability allowed population centers to grow larger than their immediate local food supply could support, because food could be stored and brought in from further afield. It enabled long-distance trade in foodstuffs, connecting regions and economies in new ways. It allowed for more specialized labor, because not everyone had to be solely focused on producing food that would spoil next week. Essentially, salt's ability to conquer decay helped lay the groundwork for more complex and resilient societies. Without salt's preservative magic, the medieval world would have been drastically different, significantly hungrier, smaller in scale, and far less capable of undertaking the grand projects, voyages, and, yes, even wars that shaped its history. It was, quite literally, a game changer. Okay, so salt is a rock star at keeping our bacon from turning into a biohazard. Impressive. But its importance goes way deeper than just preventing fuzzy food. Salt, specifically its components sodium and chloride, isn't just a flavor enhancer. It's fundamental to you being a functioning, thinking, moving human being. Think of your body as an incredibly complex electrical machine. Your nerves firing, your muscles contracting, even your brain doing its brilliant brainy things. All of that relies on tiny electrical impulses. And what helps conduct those impulses? Electrolytes. And guess what sodium and chloride are? Star electrolytes. Salt helps maintain the right fluid balance in and around your cells. Too little, and things get wonky. Your body needs it for proper digestion, for nutrient absorption, for basically every critical process that keeps you upright and not grumbling more than usual. Now, medieval folks might not have known the intricate biochemistry. They weren't whipping out textbooks on cellular respiration, but they knew they needed salt. They could feel it. Salt deficiency leads to weakness, muscle cramps, dizziness, dehydration. Basically, your body starts sending you some pretty aggressive error messages. In severe cases, it can even be fatal. So, yeah, salt wasn't just nice to have. It was absolutely must-have to not keel over. This fundamental need for salt is so deeply ingrained in our history that it's literally baked into our language. Ever heard the phrase worth your salt? Or someone being a salt of the earth kind of person? That's not just a quaint saying your grandpa uses. The word salary itself is believed to come from the Latin word salarium. This was an allowance given to Roman soldiers, which sometimes included actual salt rations, or money specifically to buy salt, because even the mighty Roman army knew its soldiers couldn't conquer the world if they were all wobbly from electrolyte imbalance. So when someone was worth their salt, it meant they were competent, valuable, deserving of their pay, because salt itself was that valuable, that essential. It's a linguistic thumbs up from history, telling us this stuff mattered a lot. And it wasn't just humans craving a salty fix. Our furry and feathery friends in the medieval farmyard were also big fans. Livestock, cattle, sheep, horses, goats, they all need salt for their health and digestion, just like we do. Farmers knew this. They'd provide salt licks for their animals, ensuring they got their necessary sodium intake. Why bother? Well, healthy animals meant more milk, better wool, stronger hides for leather, and crucially, more muscle power for plowing the fields. Remember those grains we talked about? Someone, or something, had to till the land to grow them. Strong, healthy oxen, or horses were vital. So salt wasn't just keeping the farmer alive. It was keeping the farmer's entire agricultural operation running smoothly. It was a key ingredient in the whole food production chain, from field to preserve table. No salt for Bessie the cow? Less milk for your porridge, weaker calves, and a grumpier farmer. Everybody loses. We've established salt is basically the medieval Swiss Army knife, preservative, life sustainer, animal health booster. Everyone needed it, everyone wanted it. Simple, right? Just pop down to the corner store and... Oh wait, medieval times, no corner store. And crucially, no evenly distributed salt ferry. Unlike, say, air, mostly free, mostly breathable, or fresh water, which, while not always clean, was at least geographically more common, readily accessible salt was a bit of a diva. It only showed up in certain places. If you lived by the sea, or near a magical salt spring, or on top of a giant underground salt deposit, congratulations. You were in a salty sweet spot. But for vast inland regions far from these blessed zones, getting salt was a serious headache. It wasn't something you could just dig up in your backyard next to the turnips. So how did medieval folks actually coax this precious mineral from Mother Earth? Well, there were a few main methods, and none of them sound like a relaxing weekend hobby. First up, if you lived by the seaside in a reasonably sunny and breezy spot, think the Mediterranean or parts of the Atlantic coast, you could make sea salt. Sounds idyllic, right? Sun, sea, sand. And backbreaking labor. This involved building extensive shallow ponds called salt pans. You'd channel seawater into these pans, then wait. And wait. And wait some more, for the sun and wind to do their evaporation thing, leaving the salt behind. Then came the joyful task of scraping up the salt, often by hand. It was a slow, seasonal process, entirely dependent on the weather. Too much rain? Your whole salty harvest could be ruined. Not exactly a get-rich-quick scheme, more like a get-a-sore-back-slowly scheme. Then there was rock salt, or hellite. This is salt that got trapped underground millions of years ago. To get it, you had to mine it. And medieval mining? Let's just say it wasn't big on health and safety regulations. Imagine descending into the pitch-black bowels of the earth, armed with little more than a pickaxe, a flickering lamp, and a prayer. The work was incredibly dangerous. Cave-ins, gas pockets, suffocating dust. It was dark, damp, and dirty. Some of these salt mines, like the legendary Wieliczka in Poland, became vast underground cities, complete with chapels carved entirely out of salt, which is admittedly very cool, but probably didn't make the daily grind any less terrifying for the miners. The life expectancy of a medieval salt miner probably wasn't stellar. These weren't jobs people queued up for out of sheer passion. It was brutal, essential work. They were literally chipping away at mountains of salt, bit by bit, to keep the surface world from spoiling. Our third major method involved inland brine springs. These were places where underground water flowed through salt deposits, emerging as super salty water. The trick here was to get the salt out of the water. How? By boiling it. For hours. And hours. And hours. This meant hauling massive quantities of brine, then evaporating the water away over huge fires in large lead or iron pans. It was hot, steamy work, and incredibly fuel-intensive. Entire forests could be decimated to feed the fires of the salt works. Towns like Nantwich, Middlewich, and Northwich in Cheshire, England, the witches, were famous for this, and also, probably, for smelling very strongly of brine and wood smoke. Not exactly a perfume I'd bottle. You finally wrestled your salt from the sea, the earth, or the spring. Job done? Not by a long shot. Now you had to get it to the people who actually needed it, many of whom lived miles, even hundreds of miles away. Salt is heavy. It's bulky. And medieval transportation? Think less next-day delivery, and more maybe next month if the donkey doesn't get eaten by wolves. Salt was transported on the backs of mules, in creaky carts pulled by oxen, or slowly pulled along rivers on barges. These routes, often called salt roads, were vital economic arteries. But they were also slow, expensive, and often perilous. Bandits loved a good salt convoy. It was basically a mobile treasure chest. Roads were terrible, bridges were few, and every local lord and his dog wanted to charge you a toll for passing through their territory. All these factors added significantly to the final cost of salt, especially the further it traveled from its source. By the time it reached some remote inland village, that humble salt could be worth a king's ransom, or at least a very decent chicken. So the journey from salt source to salt cellar was a long, arduous, and expensive one, making white gold a very apt nickname indeed. We've established that getting salt was a bit of an ordeal. But as any good entrepreneur knows, where there's difficulty and high demand, there's also big money to be made. The salt trade became an incredibly lucrative business in medieval times. Merchants, cities, and entire regions that controlled salt sources or the major trade routes for it became fantastically wealthy and powerful. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of controlling oil reserves or microchip factories today, if everyone needed microchips to, not starve. Venice, for example, that glamorous city of canals, built a significant chunk of its early fortune not just on spices from the east, but on trading sea salt from the lagoons around the Adriatic. They were the salt shakers of the Mediterranean, and it paid off handsomely. Up north, German cities like Lüneburg, sitting atop massive salt domes and rich brine springs, became hugely influential members of the Hanseatic League, that trading powerhouse we mentioned earlier. Their white gold was shipped all over northern Europe, greasing the wheels of commerce and lining the pockets of savvy salt barons. It wasn't just a seasoning, it was an economic engine. Now, whenever something is universally needed and hard to get, you can bet your bottom florin that rulers and governments will try to get a piece of the action. And boy, did they ever with salt. Salt was the perfect commodity to tax. Everyone needed it. From the poorest peasant to the richest noble. You couldn't really opt out. It wasn't like taxing, say, fancy silk hats. You could go without a silk hat. You couldn't go without salt. This made it a reliable, if often deeply unpopular, source of state revenue. Most infamous example of this is the French gabelle. Oh, the gabelle. This wasn't just a tax. It was a state-enforced salt monopoly that became one of the most hated and oppressive taxes in history. The crown controlled salt production and sales, forcing people to buy a minimum amount of salt at fixed, often exorbitant, prices, whether they needed that much or not. And you had to buy it from official sources. No sneaking off to your mate Dave who made some on the sly. The gabelle was so despised, it led to widespread salt smuggling, a risky but sometimes profitable profession. People would boil seawater in secret or try to sneak salt across borders. Getting caught could mean severe punishment, even death. It caused immense social unrest and is often cited as one of the simmering grievances that eventually boiled over into the French Revolution. Never underestimate the power of an overtaxed condiment to stir up trouble. Other kingdoms had similar, if perhaps less notoriously brutal, salt taxes or state monopolies. It was just too tempting a revenue stream for any cash-strapped medieval government to ignore. Salt's value was so recognized that in some places and times, it literally was currency. Forget Bitcoin, we're talking salt coin. In parts of Africa, like Ethiopia, and even in some remote areas of Europe or Asia, cakes or blocks of salt were used directly for barter and exchange. It was portable-ish, divisible, with a good whack, and universally desired. What more do you want from your money, apart from maybe not dissolving in the rain? Beyond just cash, control over salt supplies became a potent geopolitical tool. If you controlled the salt, you controlled a vital necessity. You could reward your friends and allies with favorable salt deals, or you could put the squeeze on your enemies by restricting their access. Imagine trying to wage a war if you can't preserve food for your army, or if your population is weak and demoralized from salt deficiency. Not ideal. Towns and cities literally rose and fell based on their proximity to salt or their position on crucial salt trade routes. Fortifications were built to protect salt works and salt roads. Alliances were forged, and wars were sometimes fought, with salt as a key strategic consideration. It wasn't just about flavoring stew, it was about power, influence, and the very sinews of statecraft. Now, throughout all this salty talk, some of you might be thinking, hold on a minute, what about gold? Surely gold was still the king of bling, the ultimate symbol of medieval moolah. And you're not wrong. Gold had, and still has, an undeniable allure. It's rare, it's beautiful, it doesn't rust or tarnish, which is more than I can say for my cheap costume jewelry after one sweaty medieval fair. Gold was fantastic as a store of wealth. You could bury it, melt it down, turn it into a fancy hat for your horse if you were feeling particularly flamboyant. It was used for high-value transactions, royal regalia, and decking out churches to impress both God and the parishioners. So yes, gold was definitely a big deal. No argument there. It was the Instagram influencer of medieval commodities. Shiny, aspirational, and very good at showing off. But here's the crucial difference, the salty twist in the tale. You can't eat gold. Shocking, I know. Gold can't preserve your winter food supply from turning into a furry science experiment. Gold won't stop your muscles from cramping up because your electrolytes are out of whack. Gold, for all its glitter, couldn't perform the fundamental, life-sustaining tasks that salt did every single day. Salt's value was rooted in absolute necessity. It was about survival, about the very functioning of society. Gold's value, while immense, was largely conventional. It was precious because people agreed it was precious. Think of it in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that pyramid thingy. Salt was down at the bottom, taking care of your basic physiological and safety needs. Gold? That was way up in the esteem and self-actualization penthouse, probably admiring its own reflection. If you were shipwrecked on a desert island, would you rather have a chest full of gold doubloons or a big bag of salt? One lets you season your coconuts and maybe preserve any fish you catch. The other is just heavy. So when we say salt was more valuable than gold, it's important to understand the context. We don't always mean that an ounce of salt cost more than an ounce of gold, though in some incredibly remote, salt-starved regions, the price of salt could be astronomically high, sometimes even traded weight for weight with gold, or close to it. More often, more valuable refers to its critical utility and the immense economic and political power derived from controlling something that everyone desperately needed, every single day. It's about functional value versus symbolic value. Put it this way. If you were a medieval peasant, facing a long, harsh winter with a newly slaughtered pig and a family to feed, a sack of salt was infinitely more valuable to your immediate survival and well-being than a sack of gold. One kept you alive, the other just made you a shinier corpse. So, salt was the medieval MVP, the Beyoncé of basic commodities. But like all great reigns, its absolute dominance couldn't last forever. This wasn't an overnight, oops, salt's not cool anymore situation. It was a slow burn, a gradual shift over centuries, as newfangled ideas and contraptions started appearing. One big game changer was technology, because humans are clever little monkeys when it comes to making life easier, or at least making more stuff. Improved mining techniques meant we got better and more efficient at yanking rock salt out of the ground. Bigger pumps, better tools, eventually even explosives, though probably best not to mix those directly with your food-grade salt. Better transportation, like canals and eventually railways, meant salt could be moved around faster and cheaper. Suddenly, that super expensive imported salt wasn't quite so super expensive. And then, the real kicker for salt's role as preservation king, new ways to stop food from going funky. Canning popped up in the 19th century, a revolutionary way to seal food away from those pesky microbes. And then came refrigeration, the ultimate food preserver. Suddenly you didn't need to turn your entire winter meat supply into something resembling a salt lick to make it last. Salt still tasted good, but its primary job was being outsourced. Politically, things changed too. Those ridiculously unpopular salt taxes, like the French gabelle, Eventually, even governments realized that taxing people into a salty rage wasn't sustainable. Many were reformed or abolished. Monopolies were broken up. Trade became freer. Salt became less of a strategic pawn. And through all this, what about our shiny friend gold? Well, gold just kept on being gold. Its role as a store of value, a symbol of wealth, and the go-to material for fancy tooth fillings largely persisted. It didn't rely on being the only way to keep your ham fresh, so its status remained pretty solid. So while salt's crown as most essential commodity ever began to slip, gold just polished its own and carried on. So there you have it. While gold was busy glittering in the treasure chests of kings and inspiring questionable fashion choices for dragons, salt was the silent, gritty, unglamorous workhorse of the medieval world. It was the invisible shield that kept famine at bay, the spark that kept bodies functioning, the currency that built fortunes, and the political lever that moved kingdoms. It wasn't always pretty, and getting it was often a downright miserable affair, but without salt, the medieval landscape, its food, its health, its economy, its very structure, would have been unrecognizably different, and probably a lot more bland. And even though we now get our salt from convenient shakers and giant supermarket bags, its epic past whispers to us through our language. So the next time you're in the kitchen, casually sprinkling a few crystals onto your avocado toast, or, let's be honest, liberally dousing your fries, take a moment. Give a little nod to that humble shaker. Remember a time when those tiny white grains were one of the most precious, fiercely contested, and life-altering substances on the planet. A time when salt wasn't just salt but white gold. The unsung hero that quite literally shaped the world we live in. It just goes to show, sometimes the most valuable things are the ones we take most for granted. Food for thought, wouldn't you say? If you enjoyed uncovering the surprisingly spicy history of salt, please do your medieval host a favor and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel. And if you want more historical explorations like this one, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next adventure into the past. Now, I'm really curious, what other seemingly ordinary item from history do you think has a surprisingly epic story? Drop your ideas in the comments below. I read them all, and who knows, your suggestion might just become our next video. Thanks for watching, and stay salty, my friends.